don't know what ETL is, right? So that being said, if you're very familiar with ETL and you use it on day to day, I just kind of wanted to give a high level summary, and I'm happy to get into any details or questions later. And then also you can reach out to me via Slack or email, and I'm happy to help. And it looks like we already have a question. Perfect, perfect. So the next slide answers that question. What is ETL, right? So the acronym is extract, transform, load, right? So essentially, ETL processes, we pull data from various data sources, and usually that data is pulled into staging tables. The transform stands for usually applying business rules. So you pull this data from various locations, various systems, and then you apply the business rules, the business logic that is needed by the customer that this ETL process is for. And then the load is where we push the data into the target destination, right? So that is ETL, extract, transform, load. And that was a perfect question. So this is a very high level overview of the ETL process over at Ed Plus Salesforce, which I didn't mention. I work for Ed Plus, the Salesforce team. Joined the team about 15 months or so ago, and I really enjoy what I do. I enjoy the team. It's been great. And so our ETL process, on a very high level summary, the old 30,000 foot level, right? We pull data from PeopleSoft, right? And so that's the extract. And we have SSIS staging packages that pull the data from PeopleSoft into a database that belongs to us, and we call this database DBAMP. Okay. Oh, I'm gonna back up. And then once we have the data in our local database, those staging tables I mentioned, we have some SSIS load packages that apply the business rules and push the data into what we call load tables. And then from the load tables, the data gets pushed into what we call either an insert table or an update table. And so an insert is when we're inserting a new record, and an update is updating of an existing record. And we push this data into our destination, which is Salesforce, right? Now, the one thing that I kind of want to mention that this slide doesn't really represent, I made these references to SSIS staging packages and SSIS load packages. So that's what our team uses, right? Microsoft SSIS. And I like just kind of mention I'm team Microsoft all the way. Been working in SQL Server and SSIS my entire career. But a lot of, I see around the university, I see a lot of people using Alteryx, right, as an ETL tool. I'm hearing about people that are using SnapLogic. There's all sorts of various ETL tools out there. And again, for our process, we're using Microsoft SSIS. Our ETL process runs up to 5 times a day. And we have these various modules that we load data into. And so again, just wanted to kind of keep it at a super high level with regards to how we use this ETL process on our team. So the question becomes, well, why should I monitor my ETL process, right? So anywhere I've ever worked, there's just kind of this recurring theme, if you will, where ETL processes a lot of times are just kind of a black box to all the customers and even the team that the process was built for. And a lot of times most of the time, a lot of people don't know if the process ever ran. What did it do? Did it finish? Did it fail? Was it successful? If you're familiar with SQL Server, like SQL job, the SQL job can successfully complete but not do anything. It just didn't fail, right? So a process that successfully completed that loaded 0 records didn't do anything, right? And so usually what happens most of the time is the customer calls and say, hey, I think something's not working, right? And then what happens is the unintended result is you're always being very reactive rather than proactive, right? You're never ahead of the customer. It seems like they're essentially kind of always calling and letting you know that your process is broken, right? And then there's unintentional consequences of that. Customers lose trust in the process, the data. I've worked at places where leadership they don't trust the reports, they don't trust the data because the processes were regularly not completing. And that's a bad place to be, right? Another thing about monitoring ETL process is the process running as scheduled. So I mentioned sales are on the Ed Plus Salesforce. We expect our process to run 5 times a day because we're essentially refreshing the data multiple times throughout the day because our customers need the most up-to-date data from PeopleSoft. So if we have a process that's supposed to run 5 times a day and it only successfully ran once or twice, we're back to that, like losing faith and losing trust in the system. And then also, is the process efficient, right? Is the process running as expected? And by efficient, we're talking about like run times, we're talking about record counts and so on, right? So how do you monitor an ETL process? And so the solution that we implemented at our team was we log all of the package results into a log table. And so the log table that we created, here's just a few fields from this log table. We have the process name, right? Pretty self-explanatory. So when we have a process that runs 5 times a day, I mentioned we have various Salesforce modules. Going to just throw out some module names that you may or may not be familiar with, but we have like opportunity, application, interactions, and so on, right? So every module is its own process. So when we say we have a process that runs 5 times a day, a lot of times it's all of these various modules being run 5 times a day. So if we have 10 different modules, for example, running 5 times a day, then we essentially have 50 processes running a day, right? Load status. So we basically just kind of have a Boolean, true or a 0, 1, right? 0 indicates that the process did not complete. A 1 indicates that it did. Start time and end time, self-explanatory. The total record count, how many records did the process result in, and then also how many records generated errors and how many records were successfully imported into Salesforce. And so we're back to the original ETL slide, and what I did here was just kind of indicated this is where so when the process initially starts, this step right here called log table insert. So the very first thing we do every time a process runs is we do an insert to the log table, and that creates an ID, right, which is an identity field or an identity property. And so this ID is auto-generated, and then we insert the process name, the start time, and then the load status, which is 0, right? Because the 0 just indicates that the process started. And then our process essentially kind of runs through, and then at the very end, we do a log table update. So that record that was previously inserted, we use that log ID to identify which row in the log table needs to be updated. And then this is where we insert the record count, the error record count, the imported record count, the end time, and then this is where we change the load status to 1 to indicate that the process completed. And so this is a sample. This is real. This is an example of the log table. You'll see some results, right? And so you can see the process name, the load status, the time it started, the end time, and then record counts. Now you'll see some null values because there's some columns missing, and I couldn't fit everything into the screenshot and at least have it nice and big for everyone to clearly see. But some of these tables, like the load tables I had mentioned in the previous slide, the load tables we don't have error records or imported records, right? But we do have a total record count. And then we also have staging tables. So you'll see down at the bottom, we have some metrics, if you will, for our staging processes, right? So now that we, essentially have, these processes being logged and this data being put into a table, what do you do with this data that you see here? And what we've done is we've generated an ETL scorecard, right? So We can see the total number of processes that ran up at the top. So we had, on this particular day, October 25th, we had 78 processes run. We have a total of 640,000 records, which is interesting because going back to, like, I made that comment about a lot of times ETL processes are a big black box that nobody knows anything about. People had no idea how many processes or how many even records were being processed on a daily basis, right? Before we started logging these processes. So we can see that we are processing 640,000 records a day, a little less than 1,000 error records, and then the number of records successfully imported into Salesforce, and then we have an import rate, right? So we have a successful rate of 90, almost 100%, right? So in the grand scheme of things, less than 1,000 errors on 640,000 records is pretty good, right? I've never seen zero. I mean, that's the goal, but it's, you know, you're always kind of chasing issues, and I'll just kind of pause there. And then you'll see off to the right, we have like this legend, if you will, right? So anything below 80% is bad, right? And then we're saying that 80 to 90% is kind of a caution. We need to take a look, maybe figure out what's going on. And then anything over 90%, we're giving it a green light, right? And then we can take this data and then now break it down into the various modules, right? So we can see for each module how many times the process ran, same thing, total number of records, the number of error records successfully imported, and so on. Now, you'll notice on the run count legend, what we're looking for. So we have some exceptions. We have two processes, one called FAFSA and the other called affiliation, that don't run 5 times a day, right? Those only run 2 times a day. So they have a different run count score. But we have an expectation that all of our processes successfully run 4 to 5 times a day. And that's, so we have a run count score in metric, and then our import rate, right? So now we have visibility. We can see what our process is doing every day. This report gets sent out to the leadership on our team every morning for the prior day, the results of the prior day. I had mentioned, you know, one of the bullet points I talked about before was, is the process completing, right? And so this is, you know, just again, an example of a summary, a high-level summary of what our process is doing. Is the process running as scheduled? I just mentioned that we have an expectation that this process runs 5 times a day, and we can see whether it is or not, with the exception of those 2 modules that we expect to run 2 times a day. And then is the process efficient, right? So we can also look at run times. We can see average. So this was broken down into staging versus load, insert, and update. And we can see how many times each process runs, the total number of records. So even though we're importing 635,000 records into Salesforce, we're actually touching 25 million records a day, right? Which is, like, to me, that's just nuts, right? And we can see the average record count for each process type, the average runtime. So we can kind of clearly see our load processes, right, where we essentially apply the business rules, are running relatively quickly. The data pools from PeopleSoft take the longest. And then we can see the number of failures and our success rate. All right, now another thing that we use that log table for is to monitor our ETL processes. So I had mentioned, you know, being reactive instead of being proactive. For the longest time, it seemed like our customers were always calling us and telling us about problems with our processes. And we wanted to essentially, we want to be ahead of them. And so another thing we do with this log table is we've created this process called the long-running process notification. So this is an email that is sent out that monitors the log table. And what we do is if a process is running longer than the 7-day average, then that process shows up in this email. And then we can look at like the 7-day average record count to potentially identify a spike to kind of see if that's potentially the problem. So this particular screenshot doesn't show it. Maybe the next one does. But we sometimes, for like our opportunity object, our 7-day average might be like 15,000 records. But on the first day of the semester, for example, we may have to update 140,000 records, right? And so in that scenario, we expect the process to run longer than normal. And then we can let our customer know, hey, we're updating a lot of records today, and therefore the process is running longer than normal. Rather than, I used to hear people say, oh, DBAMP is stuck or there's a glitch, right? And so again, today we're very proactive in letting our customer, we're ahead of them. In fact, we just had an issue last week. We were kind of laughing about in a stand-up that we were aware of an issue that was going on in DBAMP, which is the name of our system, 2.5 weeks before our customer told us, right? So through these notifications. So this is the one I was talking about. So on the October 27th, we were loading 118,000 or updating 118,000 records, whereas the average is usually 18,000, right? So those metrics come in handy because if we can look at the record count and kind of determine whether there's a potential problem or not, right? If we see a huge spike in the number of records being updated, then we expect the process to take longer. And that was it. So I don't know how we are on time, but do we have time for some questions, or we do? Sure. So all of the error records are logged into a table. And a lot of times, in fact, we actually, this is a great question. I could have made another slide or two. But we actually have another report that goes out every day that has an attachment of all the error records. And a lot of times, the distribution list for that is our Salesforce admins. And a lot of those errors are usually like a merged contact or a duplicate ID. The system doesn't know like which record to update. And so what I've seen the majority of the time is that when in this example, in this environment, a lot of these error records are due to the Salesforce environment, right? Again, maybe like some records were merged and now it doesn't, based on the ID, it doesn't know which record to update. I'll just kind of pause there, but I'll briefly pull up the that error report. Actually, I already looked at it this morning, and it was there. It is right here. So this report is sent out, and it gives a quick count by object, and then this is where we see the details, right? Now the 900 and so errors are a little misleading because if it's the same 100 records failing 5 times a day, it's not 500 errors, it's 100 records, right? But they all are written to a log table, and they're sent out, and the Salesforce admins work on these regularly. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. And a lot of these, so that's another good question, right? The question was, essentially kind of what happens after the error record was logged. At least that's the way I interpreted the question. So our processes, the way they're built, is that we'll continue to try to update the same record, even if it keeps failing, right? And that's just kind of essentially ensure that nothing gets missed, right? So a record will continue to essentially error out until it's successfully written. Correct. Any other questions? Yes.
So for the scope part that you were showing,
Yes.
how do you guys define that? As that based on what's the business practical or that industry standard?
Sure. That's another good question too. So this is just kind of, I'm going to say this is our team's standards, right? And yeah. And this report is generated using another Microsoft tool, SSRS. So remember, Team Microsoft. Team Microsoft. I think I really am the only person on my team that doesn't have a Mac. But anyways, yeah. So this report is generated through SSRS using that log table, and this is an SSRS subscription that's emailed out to leadership every morning. Absolutely. But I'm Team Microsoft. Any other questions? All right, well then, I'm gonna hand it over to Josh, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I mentioned, feel free to email me or Slack me if there's anything I can do to help, or if you have any questions, if this is anything you're interested in. I do, on a side note, I'm very passionate about like just data being right and not having our customers essentially lose trust in our data. Like it's a passion of mine. So thank you, and have a great conference.
And talk about, that's not going to work. Talk about what I learned this morning we're not supposed to call soft skills anymore. Durable skills, which is kind of the opposite of soft, so that was also a strong pivot. I also really like the framing of the proactive approach to that and the increasing visibility, and all of that is also part of what we're trying to do here. And there's definitely some people in the room, Ezzy's over there. She's been very instrumental in making all that stuff, the logging, the transparency happen on the warehouse side of things as well. But now we're going to talk about business analyst skills and why BI data analysts should pick up on these. So you're here because this is the description you saw. This is what I promised, so we're going to try to deliver on this. But the idea is we can learn a lot from toddlers, right? Toddlers are always learning, they're in a developmental period of their lives, and really what we should look at is that developmental period never really ends, right? Lifelong learning, crucial, develop these skills. So hopefully you're going to learn something here, and we're going to talk about requirements gathering and why that's important. So 2 items on the agenda, very simple. We're going to talk about who our target audience is, and hopefully it's you. If not, door's right there. And then we'll talk about what gathering requirements actually means. So, Sarah.
All right, so who are you? Hopefully you already know, but just for in case. So our intended audience, here. Thank you. Data analysts, developers, people who turn requests into products, project managers, product owners. We already talked about soft skills is a no word, but we can't change it yet, so ignore it. So what's in scope for today? Communicating with stakeholders is definitely in our scope for today. When? Before development, during development, after development. Basically just communicate all the time. Documentation, don't we love documentation? It's my least favorite thing, but it is so important. So yes, who, right? What, why, and how for functional development. We're going to be talking about some of that. What is out of scope? So technical skills. We're not going to be talking a whole lot of tech stuff today. The how for technical development rather than functional, and where for technical. and when. A lot of that falls under technicals. All right, so first off, gathering requirements. Ooh, already to agenda item number 2. And Josh.
All right, so there's probably several people in here who are sick and tired of hearing me talk about documentation, but we're gonna do it again. I'm gonna keep doing it until the data dictionary is completely populated. So, so even in our agile world, documentation can play a role, regardless of what certain developers tell you. So why? Because I said so, but also we want to make sure that everyone's on the same page, right? So if there's any community fans, you might recognize that scene. They were not on the same page. So that might be, we all have the same idea of what the scope is for the project. And Sam's sitting there going, you're always doing scope creep. Well, that's fine. But we want to make sure, we all want to know what we're doing. And when we're communicating with those stakeholders, with other developers, we also want to make sure that we all have the same interpretation of everything that's going on, right? We're all on the same page, and that could be active listening. And it's highlighted because I was supposed to do something with this, but oops. If you're not familiar with active listening, think of it as restating in your own words what someone just said to you, right? So it reinforces that you have the same interpretation. We want to make sure that nothing is missed during development, right? So you don't want to deliver a report and it's missing a couple crucial columns. Well, now it's unusable, right? This dashboard's missing a filter. You're going back. And we're going to talk a little bit about agile versus waterfall and why that's not a huge deal, but the more you can get done up front, the less rework you're going to have to do. And I think everyone appreciates that. And you want others other than yourself to know what's been done, right? So these might be people who are coming in later to maintain what you've done. They might be extending on it. You want to make sure that the users can use it effectively, right? So you're documenting what it does, how to use it, making sure that they're not misusing it. And I have another presentation today on using ChatGPT, and we're going to talk a little bit about why your documentation from development might be useful there as well.
So he alluded to waterfall versus agile. We're going to be talking about benefits of iteration. So traditionally waterfall. How many of you have not heard of waterfall? Okay. Oh, a few. Okay. So I'm kind of opposite. That was the first thing I learned. I didn't learn about agile until quite a ways in. So waterfall, it's a very linear process, right? Start to end, boom, like those cards, except they're starting and going backwards. You gather all the requirements, all of them, and then you build everything, right? Everything. We're finished, woohoo, have a party. Oh, wait. There's a little regret that comes after a little bit. Because what happens? Sometimes stakeholders' needs have changed by the time you get there, right? Requirements maybe weren't quite right for whatever reason, right? Sometimes it's not right. Sometimes you never even make it to step 2, right? You get so stuck in gathering those requirements, things start changing, nothing ever gets built. There's a little bit of regret with that. Agile. Although I love the little tree, I think it is like perfect for agile. They built a tree, they knew they wanted roses, and then they decided to change, right? So it's continuous, potentially chaotic, like the painting of the roses, cycle of growth. You get requirements for your POC, proof of concept. Then you build your proof of concept. Then you have a small celebration, right? Celebrate the little wins. And then you get requirements for your MVP, your minimum viable product. And then you build it. You sensing a theme here? And then you have a medium celebration, right? Because you're a little more done. It's something that's actually usable. And then you get your next requirements. What do you think comes next? Oh, you can't celebrate till you've built something, but I like where you're going. I would rather celebrate all day.
I think Sam's celebrating that you gathered the requirement.
You build that next version and then a small celebration. Then there's this potentially infinite cycle, right? It just keeps going. You do this over and over and over with however many phases you need. And then you have a huge party because it's where you want it, and it's amazing because you took the time to go through these different phases to get what you needed. So those are huge differences. But there is best of both worlds. There are some things we can learn from each, and you need to keep in mind. Aspects of waterfall, documentation, huge, right? We've talked about that. Josh will continually talk about that. Proactive considerations, measure twice, cut once. That is a clear waterfall thing. There's a solid baseline and direction. It stays the same. There's no change with waterfall. Some aspects of agile that are good to keep in mind: revision, adaptation, iteration, responding to environmental changes because they happen, like stakeholders. Sometimes they change. Your needs or objectives change. You may be in the middle of it and you're like, whoa, this is not coming out the way we want. We need to switch gears. Budget, staffing. I know our team has changed a lot in the last year, so it happens. And then, of course, technology changes. These are always things we have to think about when we're responding to environmental changes. Delays, unforeseen things, outside factors, bugs as you're developing, all sorts of things. And the best, many small victories. Celebrate those because they're wonderful.
I think really quick, I'm going to go back and I want to speak to something that was discussed at the chat this morning. Right, we're talking about many small victories. They talked about failure as well, right? And one of the benefits of Agile is you can maybe learn a little bit more and respond more easily to lots of little small failures rather than one big failure that's just a dagger in the heart that you might get at the end of a waterfall project.
Excellent.
All right, so the importance of understanding the business. We're here at ASU. This is a very large university with lots of very complicated business functions. So this is maybe not a small task, but it's beneficial to you to understand the processes that create the data that we're looking to use. Right, so we have some fantastic SMEs out there, and they generally know the business processes. They can relate them to the data. They can tell you why the data is the way it is. But the SMEs can only take you so far. So if you want to understand the data yourself, understand the data quality, you're talking about quality data is important, right? Absolutely agree, 100%. You want to understand the process that creates it, because if, for instance, I'm looking at GPA data and I see some conflicting information, which is I have a 5.0 GPA on a 4.0 GPA scale in transfer data, for instance, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But once I understand how that data got there, it helps me to treat it in maybe a specific way. I can make some assumptions based on that information. So a little more educated assumptions. Understanding how the data was created, captured, and processed. So how did it get there? Who touched it? What systems were in play? How much of that was manual versus automated? All of that stuff. So technical aspects, the functional environment in which it was created. So how are people operating? Is this a group that's just trying to get things done, or are they really taking the time to get things done correctly? You can get bias. So if you're working with survey data, understanding how the survey was created, how it was tested, how it was validated, noise in the data, outliers, all of that can be largely explained by understanding how the data got there. The reliability of the data, the accuracy of the data, the completeness of the data, and then the meaning and representation. So these are all things that are important to understand in order to appropriately and efficiently use the data. So I'm very big on nuance, and it drives some people crazy, some people in this room, but it's important to document, because when you're going through the data, if you don't understand the outliers and one of your customers sees them, it's really hard to explain it to them. So get out in front of it, be proactive. And then data dictionary, business glossary, it's really nice if it's documented. Again, going back to the earlier slides, then everyone can understand these things. Hey, look, I talked about GPAs already. One of the things you can do when you first get access to the data, in addition to talking to the SMEs, talking to the stakeholders, go ahead and just do a quick data profiling. Alteryx has some data profiling tools, for instance, and it'll give you an idea of what's in each of the columns, help you identify any potential problems that you can then go back and ask the SMEs, the providers, about. So ranges of the data, outliers, frequencies, distributions, all that can also tell you information about the data, but you can also use that to verify what you've been told by the data owners, because sometimes they think it's one thing and it's not, and the data doesn't lie most of the time. It depends, yes. Oh, I should have worn my It Depends shirt tomorrow. All right, so logical errors, inconsistencies. Those are things that you cannot identify without understanding what the data is supposed to represent. All right, so we have an example here of a Slack post, which I think speaks to these concepts. So what sources are used in creating this specific dashboard? Well, Mary, of course, knows the answer to that. So she explains where the data is coming from, and that also kind of helps to speak to what it's supposed to be used for, right? Public facing, official data. There's going to be some differences due to these requirements, right? That's very important to know before you go and use the dashboard. Here's another one. Lucas is asking about this military column, which has come up a few times in the last couple of years. And it's really good to know that, oh, maybe you shouldn't be using that, even though it's out there and it looks potentially useful, right? So understanding what created the data, what it means, any potential issues. And this one, oh, look, we got David here. So Haley was asking about a fairly complex topic, talking about student plans and effective dating and statuses. And David gives some suggestions on how to use that data, right? So he knows how to use it because he knows how it was created, what it represents, all that important information, right? And there's some follow-up questions and all of that. And then of course, Jennifer jumps in because she knows freaking everything, talking about backdating and all of that stuff. So our data is not always simple. It's rarely simple. It's usually more complicated than you think it is, or than anyone wants to make you believe it is. So it's important to really drill into all of that. Yeah, someone should get on that. So we talked about creating data, but that's the upstream. What about the downstream? It's also important to know what's going to be using that data, right? So this is where you're talking to their stakeholders before, during, after. You want to know what they think they want versus what they actually need, because those are rarely the same thing. So it's up to you to determine what they need. It's up to them to tell you what they want. So they might have a predisposition based on prior experiences, right? This is how I'm used to doing it. This is, what I think I need based on my interpretation of the environment and my stakeholders and all that stuff. They might only be looking for data to support their prior assumptions, in which case you might just tell them to hit the road. They might understand the process, the data, or how to use the data, right? All that stuff we talked about, the upstream information. Sometimes they might understand what the limits are, what they need to potentially address along the way. That's up to you to help connect those dots, right? They might be oversimplifying situations. If you've ever worked with someone with a C at the beginning of their title, they don't care about nuance, right? They think everything's simple. So again, you have to drill in with questions to figure out how to address all of that. How we get the data, what data we get, how we process it, all of that is typically use case dependent, right? So this is why we have lots of dashboards out there, but for some reason we still find ourselves creating custom reports all the time. And that's because you can't create a few dashboards that satisfy all use cases. So it depends. So for instance, term and semester, there's a specific commonly used data set out there that has a column called term and a column called semester. They're not the same thing. Which one you use very much depends on your use case. Course versus class, those are often used very interchangeably, but if you're working with the data, they are very different things. If you send someone a report on, let's say, average course GPA, and they were looking for average class GPA, you're going to be doing some rework. So get all that stuff figured out up front based on your downstream use cases. Admit term versus rec term, right? They look kind of similar. They're often the same thing, but they mean different things. They need to be used differently. Right? Lots of red flag words. These are things you want to drill into. Enrolled, international, cohort, program, matriculated, GPA, location, Starbucks, market. All of these terms are thrown out, but different people mean different things when they say these. One person can mean different things when they say them at different points in time, right? So you have to understand the nuance, understand how they're using it, why they need it. So operational activity versus analytical use cases have different requirements, right? So if you're doing something with operations, you might want names and deskers. If you're doing something with analytics, you might want IDs and codes. The level of denormalization is very different for these different use cases, often, right? If you're building a dashboard, now I guess we have Tableau relations, but it used to be highly denormalized. Other reports were highly denormalized. Statistical analysis is highly denormalized. But if you're doing other functions, you actually need to normalize the data for different efficiencies and clarities. Wide versus long, kind of similar to the denormalization. And accuracy. If you have a request that's going to be used for analytical purposes, your required accuracy is probably a little bit lower than if you're doing something operationally. If you're doing something operationally, you're reaching out to a student, you want to make sure they have the right data. If you're creating summary metrics on a dashboard, you just need to be in the ballpark to give them that perspective. All right, so yeah, why? Ask your users why. What question they need to answer, what problem do they need to solve? And we are short on time, so I'm just going to jump through that.
Asking questions. Ooh, why am I so much louder than you?
I think Sam turned my volume down.
Okay. So I love to ask questions, and hopefully you guys will, if you're not already loving it, you should learn to love it, because that's how you get better requirements. Ask why. Keep asking why. Start with some of these. Here's some tips. Who? We're going back to the who, what, when, where. Know your stakeholders and resources. What needs to be very clear. When? Are they flexible? Do you need multiple iterations of things? Where? The delivery mechanism. Is it, are you going to deliver it as a dashboard or like just a straight list? Why? Again, always asking why, unless they already told you, but sometimes you need to clarify the why. How? Generally something you should figure out, but helpfully with them as well. What question do they need to answer? What problem do they need to solve? There's a theme. Keep asking those. Iterate, ask, explore, ask, develop. When do you have enough? That's a trick question. You can almost never have enough, so just keep doing it. You're going to cycle between process, stakeholders, SMEs, and data SMEs to understand all the aspects. And again, he talked about it earlier, active listening, restating things. So what I'm hearing is, think about these. If it's not a normal thing for you, practice it in the mirror. Just start asking yourself questions. Summarize decisions, steps, assumptions, and requirements. These are some huge tips that will help you make sure you have really good requirements to be able to provide what your stakeholders are asking for. Some tools to help you create your blueprint. Use cases and user stories. What are they? Mechanisms to capture specific requirements for the product based on detailed examples of what it needs to have or do, how it will be used. Here's some examples quickly. As an academic program director, I need to know how my programs are performing relative to others so that I know if corrective actions are needed, and if so, where good ideas may be found. And some acceptance criteria, provide them with a list of programs, retention rates, graduation rates, GPAs. If you're thinking through all those questions before, hopefully you have questions about these. They're not very specific. So we changed some things. I need to know how my STEM plans are performing relative to other STEM plans. Get more specific. And then change some of your acceptance criteria to get it more specific so you know exactly what you're supposed to provide. Dashboard, career desker filter, STEM filter, all of those things. I'm going to skip over reading it out loud.
Take another example, another Hornsby. Next.
Data elements and data dictionary and business glossary. So Josh.
This is an example of the documentation we're talking about. This is for the EADS and actionable analytics projects. We use a template like this, but it's basically what's going into the enterprise data dictionary. So it tells you about the development process. We've got different columns for interacting with different stakeholders, different SMEs, but we're building up to that final product by going through and clarifying what we need, what does it need to look like, where's it going to come from, what needs to be done to it along the way.
So I'm going to skip through. If you come back and look through the slides, we do have screenshots of some examples.
Hey, look, on time.